Before we move on to the event and the panelists, let me take a minute to introduce ideas. So on behalf of Politics, Society and History Constellation and Ideas, we all welcome you to the book launch. Um, Before we invite the author to speak about her work, I would like to briefly introduce the Office of Interdisciplinary Studies at OB General University. IFS is dedicated to advancing social science scholarship through innovative collaboration in research and pedagogy. Positioned at the intersection of diverse fields, ideas brings together ideas, methods, and perspectives that cross traditional disciplinary boundaries. By nurturing this dynamic intellectual space, the office supports research and dialogue where different forms of knowledge converge, encouraging new ways of thinking, collaborative practice, and meaningful engagement in contemporary social issues.
I'll first begin by introducing our author. Dr. Priyanka Chandra, the author of the book, is Associate Professor at Chandra School of International Affairs, JSIA, OB Global University, where she teaches politics and international relations. Her specialization is on state, democratization, and political Islam, with research interests in nationalism, the public sphere, gender, especially women's movements, with a focus on West Asia, North Africa, and more recently, South Asia. She also looks at intersections of religion and politics in the ideological evolutions in political Islam and its role in the contemporary world.
May I now introduce Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan. Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan is the Nelson Mandela Chair at Mahatma Gandhi University, Kerala, and formerly Professor, Center for West Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Former positions he has held also include Director, Human Rights Studies Program, School of International Studies, JNU, in Delhi. Chairperson, Center for West Asian Studies, SIS, JNU, Professor and Director, Center for West Asian Studies, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi.
We also welcome Dr. Fazlur Rahman Siddiqui, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Indian Council of World Affairs. His area of specialization is political Islam, socio-cultural, strategic, and identity politics in the Arab world. Being well versed with Arabic language, he has written extensively on the Arab world, emerging geopolitics across the region, political Islam, and the concept of Islamic State. He's the author of 5 books. His most recent book is Arab World in Transition and the Quest for a New Regional Order, among several others.
Introducing Dr. Rohit Jyotish. Dr. Rohit Jyotish is an assistant professor at the Chandra School of International Affairs. He's a political economist with research interests in public finance, political economy issues like welfare regimes, energy transition, and state capacity, along with labor studies.
The format of the session will be as follows. We will begin with the author presenting remarks about the book, followed by Dr. A.K. Ramakrishnan, followed by Dr. Fazlur Rahman Siddiqui, and then Professor Rohit Jyotish, followed by short commentaries by Riddhi and myself.
Taking 1 minute to introduce ourselves, my name is Riddhi Deokar. And that is Manjaya. And apart from being students of third year BA Global Affairs, we are also students of Professor Chandra. And we have learned more than we can imagine from Professor.
Our remarks are nothing but burning questions we have pondered for the past 3 years, and who better than Professor Chandra to put?
Yeah, Professor, a little bit. We'll now move on to the main highlight of the event.
Thank you, Riddhi, and this one. Thank you, Riddhi and Mansi, for that very elaborate introduction. And good afternoon to everyone. Thank you all for being here. This means a lot to me, and I'm especially honored to have such a wonderful panel put together of my supervisor, Professor Ramakrishnan, who's here to speak. He's joining from Kerala, so a big thank you to him. To Dr. Siddiqui, who's from IECWA, and I've been following his work, so I'm most keen to hear his comments. And likewise for my colleague, Professor Jyotish. So this is indeed very exciting, even more so because students are involved, so that always makes it very special. Okay. I thought what I would do is just talk a little bit about
what led me to work on this book, on this particular idea, and something that I've been working on and living with for a very long time. So it's almost surreal to speak about it, but I thought I'll talk a little bit about the kind of questions and curiosities that led me to it, and then of course just briefly introduce the book. I leave most of the time for everyone else to speak, and I'm also very curious to hear everyone. Um, but my foray into the region started with, knowing some of the very general things that one seems to know about West Asia, or is more inaccurately called the Middle East. And so I had a lot of questions and curiosities, and I began by looking into questions of religion and politics and the intersections of that. That was my earlier work, and from that, I kind of moved into thinking about, broader politics, because while I was very familiar with Western political thought, and a lot of those ideas are, very elegant theories of social contract and citizenship and how one arrives at these ideas, the more I looked at West Asia in particular, but also the broader global South, it comes about very clearly that there are things that are perhaps not explained or accounted for or even acknowledged in some of the more, the Western lenses through which politics continues to be studied today. And that is a problem that we made for ourselves somewhat, and one that pervades now both the academic world as well as the world of politics and policy formulation. And so there was, both from a very personal location and also thinking about the discipline, thinking about the region and global politics, I felt that perhaps it would be interesting to look at theorizing on the state in the post-colonial context and in the context of the global South. And of course, this was a tall order, so I took up a rather ambitious task. And subsequently, I realized that there were some problems also that one has to tackle. So why post-coloniality and why Egypt in particular? First of all, of course, there's this idea of, we talk about the post-colonial world in the historical sense as a definite moment of transition that has happened. And we are now looking at the state and what happens, at the level of citizenship within that. But of course, the more one delves into the history of countries like Egypt and other places in West Asia and even elsewhere in the global South, you see that there are interesting threads continuing from the colonial and even pre-colonial times, and they integrate and mix with the modern state system in very interesting ways, producing some very peculiar realities, which are extremely complicated. And that brought me to the other question, which was again the question like inverting the lens and questioning the lens itself that we look at the region from, because a lot of the theorization on the state, democratization, development, these are things that emerge from a very Western-centric prism. And so, it remains rather limited in its scope and how it looks at this region, and perhaps doesn't account for a lot of things, right? And there's this very interesting element of cultural relativism and cultural exceptionalism, where in fact things like religion, things like ethnicity, things like the kind of diversity we have in other parts of the world are one seen as problems and written off, in that way, and two, that even the kind of broader theorization that you see with a lot of Oriental scholars, and how they disparage the region for being, a failure at democratizing or modernizing sufficiently and so on, is something that has been a continuous problem. And it comes from this Oriental lens. So even the very nature of that theorization was something that seems to be a little problematic or seemed to have some serious gaps in it. And of course, you cannot be looking at this region or looking at state level politics without, constantly, confronting that vexed question of democratization in West Asia, right? So the two most contentious terms today in politics in general are democratization. I would argue that it's no longer just limited to West Asia. It's a crisis in most parts of the world, including the so-called developed world, as I say this with inverted commas. But the question of democratization and sustained democratization, as opposed to treating it as one singular event, is something that perhaps we all need to be thinking about more deeply. And likewise, the other most contentious question, of course, is development. This whole categorization and clubbing of or separating of countries and putting them into different categories has been on account of development and sometimes an Oriental lens, sometimes views of cultural exceptionalism, as I was mentioning, combined with what is usually a very narrow idea, a very specific liberal idea of what development is supposed to be, means that these regions are actually treated as in very colloquial Oriental terms beyond civilization, right? So it felt like an urgent project to sort of disrupt some of these disciplinary definitions or lenses as much as looking in depth at actually what is the nature of the post-colonial state. And that's how I arrived at this particular question. And it's especially important for countries like Egypt, Iran, India. These are all places where, and why I particularly picked up Egypt was because, of course, I am very interested in it, but also because these are all very old, in fact, ancient societies. So they've been homes of ancient civilizations, and as societies, they've had a very great amount of social and political mobilization, a very high political culture traditionally, and in fact, it is the state system which is new and colonially imposed top down, which is what creates a lot of these problems. And a lot of problems of, let's say, political instability, lack of development, and of course, the question of democratization or the lack of it. And it seemed like the right place to start with this particular question. But of course, I was also hoping to have to arrive at some broader conclusions which one could extrapolate to the broader global south also. Not to say that we shouldn't be, taking into account the very specific nuances of real politics of whatever place we're looking at. My whole attempt in my entire study is to move away from any broad generalizations, which is one of the afflictions of West Asian studies. So in this book, I'm looking at a very specific period, which is 1970 to 2011. So it's the period from the coming of Anwar Sadat following Gamal Abdel Nasser to the end of the period of Hosni Mubarak. And in a way, it can also be seen as understanding the long durée causes of the Arab uprising, which started in 2011, right? And of course, the instant trigger, the instant catalyst of that particular set of uprisings. A lot of people have called it Arab Spring or Arab Winter, and they all seem to be rather perjured of Western terms. So I will say Arab uprisings, but the immediate catalyst for it, of course, was economic, starting in Indonesia, spreading to Egypt, and thereby the rest of the region, and even beyond the region. But when you take a deeper, longer view of things, you realize that there are multiple factors which are actually speaking to each other, sometimes complicating each other, and that needs to really be understood with a somewhat microscopic lens. So I was looking at 3 different variables to see how this whole question unfolds, and so I looked particularly at the role of the political elite, which in Egypt has been military in this particular period. And of course, I'm not going to talk to you about all the details of it. I leave something in the book for you to delve into. But just broadly, the role of the military in Egypt is something that is very interesting, but it's something that has been perceived in very interesting ways by the citizenship also. So whether it is the way in which the military sort of occupies the state apparatus and subsequently the bureaucracy and other aspects of the state, but also how it emerges as a very unique socio-political class and a distinct class, and its behavior as a class, and its perception by the citizenship as a class is something that was very interesting, and I spent some time looking at that. And it had a range of aspects to it, whether it was the persona of the leader concerned and how they were positioning themselves. both Sadat and Nasser, both Sadat and Mubarak were coming in the wake of Nasser, whose public image and his charismatic hold on the people was extremely high and phenomenal. So much so that even after the loss of the Arab side in the 1967 war, he was still considered and revered as the hero. Um, at a time when people were impoverished and the cost of war had further, created a very dire set of circumstances financially and economically. So the positioning of, Anwar Sadat particularly in the wake of Nasser's regime and what happened and this attempt to present himself as a slightly more, liberal ruler, but of course within the same sort of structural system was very interesting. And something that culminated, of course, in the Chandra reports and his assassination after that. But that also was mirrored by or ran parallel with some interesting developments that happened within that small window of relative freedom that was afforded to political opponents. And similarly, then the coming of Mubarak has to be seen in juxtaposition to what was happening in Egypt before. So you see a leader who's a lot more conservative, not as open to media scrutiny, and very, very prudent when it came to navigating the political battlefield and particularly his opponents. So you see the space getting more and more restricted. The reason I mentioned the class aspect is because first of all, of course, the regime is not just one person as much as we are the face of it, but also it's the social and economic aspects of how this whole enterprise started functioning, building a military technocratic nexus and various such things, and how that was being witnessed and experienced by people on the streets also. So that is one aspect of it. And that then sort of correlated to something else that happened. 1970-71 was also a very important period, a very important time in Egyptian history because this was when the infidel policies, the open door policies come into place. If anyone is not very familiar with that region, I think just as a very, very loose parallel, give the example of the 1991 liberalization, privatization, globalization policies that came up in India, but very different also. So effectively, what it did was, shift the thrust from socialist principles to liberalizing very quickly under the infidel policy. So the open door policy was essentially opening up the Egyptian economy to the world and to global political economy. Of course, there's a lot of study, whether it's in dependency theory, whether it's in a lot of the work that happens now, development. I'm hoping Professor Jyotish will speak a bit on that. There's a lot of critical work on the effects and the impact of these kind of policies against the promises that were made and how on paper they seem to be excellent ideas. But because of both the peculiar and the ubiquitous realities in specific parts of the world, this has, and I'm not taking that third worldism idea of Christopher Clapham, but saying that very specific kinds of developments that happen in countries like Egypt meant that not only were those objectives of liberalization not really achieved, but liberalization itself became something else and something very problematic when it started interacting with various aspects of political rule, the nature of bureaucracy, this whole military technocratic nexus that was coming up and so on. And that again is something that creates its own problems for the economy, which is again one big variable that I'm looking at. Of course, there's a lot to cover, and this book by no means claims to be exhaustive, but of course, this is a huge chunk of the book. I will highlight, there's a lot of information and data and statistics, some statistics which are there. But the thing that I will highlight, which I think is very necessary when you're looking at this kind of work and all this jargon and all this, rhetoric around development, is the experiential element of it. That is what I was also trying to bring in because there are a lot of these macroeconomic figures, a lot of projections of what development is supposed to be and what it is going to achieve. which doesn't account for what is really happening on the ground, right? It doesn't account for, I always talk about things like, the poverty line, this mythical poverty line that, you have very strange definitions coming from international institutions of, if a person can afford one meal per day, then they are not below the poverty line. But you can imagine clearly what scope that person has for any chances in life or any dignity in living, right? And those are the things that are missed in these, in reducing this experience to numbers and statistics. So, one of the things that came up in my study was, of course, there was extreme poverty in many places and extreme deprivation that happened because the local economy was suffering at the hands of this very rapid neoliberalization that started. But the ways in which it was experienced is sometimes undocumented, unaccounted for, and therefore rendered invisible. Things like relative poverty, things like having a car or a refrigerator, but not being able to afford basic consumable goods, not being able to afford food every week. These are the kind of things that often don't figure in the IMF papers and the World Bank papers and the kind of policies also they trust on it. And so, of course, with the intra policies and subsequently with the heavy borrowing from international financial institutions comes this kind of additional problem of the structural adjustment program being enforced by the IMF and how that also starts altering the nature of the state in amounting to loss of sovereignty essentially and forced political as well as economic reforms which further complicated the realities on the ground. And of course, that also, like I said, there's this, two-pronged issue in the book that has to be constantly addressed, where even notions of development that are being thrust upon societies like Egypt by IMF, by World Bank have to be questioned constantly. So it also then brings in of necessity, brings in a very clear critique of ideas like structural adjustment and this whole business of neoliberalization and what that has done. Of course, there's a lot of space dedicated to that, but the most important aspect of this, and like I said, what I was interested in was, again, the lived experience of what it is to be in this space, right? Coming back to the question of the state, if I just momentarily bring in the social contract, the state is an edifice which is, to begin with Hobbes, it's a product of, a contract between citizens, amongst citizens, and subsequently becomes a contract between the state and the citizens with various terms, right? As political philosophy evolves. But what becomes increasingly apparent in these kinds of societies, and I'm not making a broad generalization here, but particularly in Egyptian society, is that it is something that has to be consistently, constantly dynamic. It has to be constantly evolving. And that is something that is evidenced by the nature of social transformations that are happening, both in response to the role of the regime and the kind of impact of individualization. So, that is actually where you see the real kind of flux and the real kind of, as I was mentioning earlier, the high political culture and the political engagement of people in the kinds of ingenious methods, of how civil society, and I take a broader view of civil society. So both, of course, the organized civil society, but also the unorganized civil society, the disparate movements, individuals, ideas, the non-movements, as Africa calls them, the ones who don't want to be seen, right, by the state. But even those, with their existence, with simply surviving in spaces which are becoming increasingly hostile, and this also reflects in very specific physical, tangible changes, like changes in cities and spatiality. So that also how you occupy space or how you're pushed out of the space, how inclusive or exclusive it is, and what you embody simply by being present, maybe as a squatter, as a street vendor, as a slum dweller in that place, which is fast shutting down to you. All of that is part of those social transformations that I'm talking about. one of the problems I felt, as a student of West Asian politics in 2000, around 2011, 12, was people were constantly asking or discussing West Asian politics and the Arab uprisings in terms of success or failure, right? And that was looking very specifically at regime change. And I written a very short piece then saying when Mubarak goes home, where does Egypt go? Because I myself was also very concerned about, what, I mean, regime change is a very small or a very myopic occurrence in the longer political trajectory of the state, right? But what happens after? Change isn't really complete unless it is also structural, it is also systemic and so on. And while that's important, through this much longer study, I also feel that this question of the success and failure of the uprisings is also perhaps misplaced because there's something more important that happened in those uprisings, which is this whole process of social transformations, which kind of peaked at one time. It's still ongoing. It's constantly ongoing, but that is something that is very interesting because there is a constant renegotiation of the social contract by the citizenry. And the popular theses, whether it's democratization theory or other such ideas of, uh, focusing democracy entirely on electoral politics or other such things, it kind of misses this very important aspect of political culture and public participation. So some very interesting things emerged very quickly. I'll just sum up. One, of course, was that democratization theory itself, after this whole study, seems very problematic because it is trying to focus on some very specific variables to say this is how, through this very specific formulaic approach, democracy is to be achieved. And that does not account for the kind of resistance, the kind of social movements, and I'm not romanticizing them, but these are things that are happening on the street very regularly, even after the uprisings. We are over a decade after the uprisings, you see that still these things are happening. You see different kinds of actors, different kinds of influences which are still there. You see some of the ideas that were, that germinated at the time of the Arab uprisings. You see a very high level of debate, whether it is on the question of what place religion will have in public politics, what place it can have in thinking about the state and any kind of substantial reform in the state, what kind of impact it will have on the question of women's status and what place they are afforded in the political system as political beings, as political agents and economic agents. So all of these are questions that actually, they're kind of like ongoing, unfolding, evolving forces in the Egyptian society and in the broader Arab society. And so, I would say that that is actually a major accomplishment and also something that we are still seeing unfolding. And the other point, of course, is the one that I began with, post-coloniality is extremely complex and contentious, and it is very difficult to, also narrow it down to one specific thing. But at the same time, what emerges in this study is the fact that a lot of this mainstream theorization, not just on democracy, but also terms like authoritarianism, it is seen as absolute. Terms like, or things like, what does development mean? As I was saying, it's one of the most contentious things. The way that these are defined also needs to be expanded beyond a very myopic focus and, rethought considerably. And that was, to that end, the state and what the post-colonial element of the state means, both in terms of political developments and also in terms of what academic lens we take to it, is something that I hope the book complicates it more for the reader than making it simplified, because that is really the interest and what I think is required. So I will stop here, but I'm most keen to hear what others have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your remarks and for also allowing us to be privy to your thoughts and your debates that you went through. Without further ado, I'll move on to Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan. I invite him to give his remarks. Over to you, Professor.
I hope you can hear me. Is it all right?
Yes, Professor.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Professor. You're audible.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for making me part of this gathering. Dear moderators, fellow panelists, and very important Dr. Priyanka Chandra, whose book that we are taking up for discussion today. I congratulate her for an extremely significant work that she has done, particularly in the broader field of international relations and in the specific fields of post-colonial studies and West Asian studies. My own long associations with Dr. Priyanka Chandra makes me much more responsible in a sense to talk about her work with all its seriousness. I've seen the kind of intellectual development that was, happening with her engagement with both theory and area studies in general. The theoretical aspect of this study is significant because Egypt is not a typical kind of post-colonial state. It has all the characteristic features of that. The kind of implications of colonialism that had in India and what Egypt went through are different in the trajectories. You had French influence during the turn of the century from the 18th to 19th, the Napoleonic invasion and so on, and then the British colonial influence and various kinds of administrations that were coming up, the monarchist system in Egypt, and then the Egyptian revolution in the early 1950s. You have a very unique kind of political development in Egypt. And looking at that political history through the lens of the function of the state is what is undertaken here. Particularly the characteristic features of the Egyptian state at a critical juncture of its transformation from a Nasserite Arab nationalist socialist provider kind of state to Anwar al-Sadat's neoliberal kind of state, which withdrew from many of the provider roles that the Egyptian state played under Nasser. And some of the cracks in Egyptian political system became evident during Anwar al-Sadat's time. And one can trace the origins of the Arab uprising in general, the Egyptian uprising of 2010, 2011, in those developments under Sadat, particularly the neoliberal transformation, not only in the economy, but neoliberal influence in politics, the whole reorientation of the state, new constitution, pro-Western policies, especially great influence by the United States in Egyptian politics, the new relationship with the state of Israel, Sadat's visit to Jerusalem in 1977, the signing of the Camp David agreements in 78, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty in 1979, and so on and so forth. So big transformation in the character of the Egyptian state under Sadat. And under Nasser, the question of legitimacy of the state was not the main thing that people were discussing. Academics also were discussing because of the charisma of the leader, because Nasser came from the ordinary backgrounds, and because of the popularity he had with the Arab nationalist idea and so on. And he was the hero in the Bandung conference in 1955. And very significant figure in the non-aligned movement which emerged after Bandung. So because of that kind of popularity, not only in Egypt, across the Arab world, the critical questions about the state and its relationship with Egyptian civil society was not a major, problem area. Some of the cracks started coming, especially after the defeat in 1967, in the 1967 war. 1956 Suez Crisis was a kind of victory for Nasser, even though not a military victory, but it was a political victory. But 67 war was a huge defeat for Nasser, losing the Sinai Peninsula, losing the influence on the whole Palestinian issue and everything of that sort. We, academics used to say that Nasser, 67 was Nasser's political death, even though he died in 1970, as you know. But the cracks between the state and the civil society started emerging under Sadat in a big manner due to the changes that I've already noted, and what Dr. Priyanka has mentioned in her presentation today also, that in FIDA policy, open door policy, and I was somebody who was visiting Egypt and following the developments at close quarters from the early 90s. I lived there for quite some time, and by the 90s, some of the effects of the 1970s economic changes were extremely visible. You could see actual gap, the income gap between the rich and the poor increasing. Huge migration from the villages to cities like Cairo, big shanty towns developing. Whenever you visit, each time you can see how these areas were expanding with poor people from the countryside coming to the cities. The gap was there for everybody to see. So that is where questions of legitimacy, etc., comes to the fore. Because under Sadat, because of the kind of unprecedented political steps that he has taken, many of his followers and some academics also thought that he was a kind of revolutionary figure within quotes, because someone who took extraordinary leadership and shown courage to deviate from the Nasserite tradition. So that kind of denasserization that was happening under Sadat was hailed by some people. But this gap between Egyptian society and the state was increasing, and that's extremely significant. One of the so-called stabilizing factors in Egyptian politics has been the military, as we know. The Nasserite revolution was a military-initiated revolution. The free officers conducted that revolution in 1952. The Sadat also came from that tradition. And under Mubarak, now you see under Sisi, the military is much more active, as you know, in politics. But they have been a central agency within the Egyptian state, which wielded tremendous power across its political development over the last 70 years or so. And Dr. Priyanka Chandra described the transformation of Egyptian military in one of her chapters, deals with that question in great details, actually. And there were criticisms of the Nasser era, the role of the military, etc., and the military's connections that were developing with Egyptian economy. Criticisms were coming from well-known scholars like Anwar Abdul Malik, and there was an understanding about the Egyptian state that its class orientations are not to the extent common people being benefited out of the state at all levels. It's mostly the kind of military and newly emerging classes in business classes in Egypt. They were benefiting out of the whole popular regime of Nasser. And Sadat's, that division was obvious. Everybody understood that newer market forces, multinational corporations who started investing in Egypt, the kind of, as she has discussed here as well, those structural adjustment policies that he has undertaken, all those things created newer tensions. The Arab uprising in 2010-11 especially in early 2011 in Egypt, you could see that many people across the world were surprised that there is an Arab uprising, starting from Tunisia to Egypt, to Yemen, to Syria, to Bahrain, and so on and so forth. Anybody who studies about West Asia knows very well that this is a region of great political activism. People's movements, civil society movements, political movements of various kinds are not alien to the people of the region. Rather, it is the other way around. People of the region have always been engaged in various forms of political activism against the state, against imperialist interest in the region, restructuring their own society and state and various kinds of things. For example, the communist movement in Iran, in Turkey, in Palestine, in Egypt, and so on. The feminist movements, which have been very, very significant. And countries like Egypt were, in the forefront of the women's movement of various kinds. I think you know that the Egyptian Feminist Union was founded in 1923 by Huda Sharawi, and later very significant figures like Dr. Doria Shafiq, Nawal al-Saadawi, the famous novelist, writer, and doctor, innumerable feminist activists in the whole region, but in Egypt in particular. And if you look at the 1930s and 40s politics of Egypt, you could see women demonstrating in the streets for changes in the legal system, in the personal law especially. And in the late 40s and early 50s, you could see women's political activism through feminist kind of point of view, rather than simple women's organizations. There's a politics of feminism working there. So under Doria Shafiq, you could see women marching in thousands to the Egyptian parliament, demanding political participation for women and so on. So under Sadat, the women's activism became much more, more dynamic because of the schism that was developing in the society between the kind of poverty that ordinary people were feeling, Egyptian state withdrawing from welfare mechanisms. The Nasserite state, even though Nasser suppressed many of the feminist movements of his time, he incorporated some of their demands into the state policy, like, making the aish, the bread, in public factories so that women can be relieved out of the duties in the kitchen and so on. Women were able to come to government jobs and other public kind of activities and so on due to those policies. Nasser's revision of Sadat's reorientation of Egyptian policy and all the withdrawal from, withdrawing resources from welfare sectors created big trouble for women, because their opportunities for entering into newer fields, etc., they thought that this is going to be a stumbling block. So women's movement were in the forefront of critiquing the kind of regime that Sadat was heading at that point of time. Even though, Jihan Sadat was in a way part of the women's movement, and you had the famous Jihan's law coming up because of the demands of the feminist movement. Some demands were met by the state and so on and so forth. The point I was arriving at was this region in general, and Egypt in particular, had very significant movements, political movements of various kinds, women's movements of various kinds, and movements of the younger people of different genders, especially coming up after the 1990s, because of various reasons. Most important, the question of unemployment and corruption in the state system. So newer trade unions were emerging, the Kefaya movement, for example. Unlike traditional trade unions, which were affiliated to political parties, etc. So what we call at that point of time, those movements as new social movements were emerging in a big manner, and many of which had younger people in the leadership. So what you had under Mubarak, culminating in the 2011 uprising, was a continuation of this gap between the state and the civil society, and the long tradition of creating movements by people, both against the state and against foreign interest and dominance, imperialist interest in a big manner. So this book is significant in searching the cracks in the system, in the political system, and what role the civil society played. And how did the civil society not merely negotiate with the state for strategic advantages, but really oppose the state at various junctures, and how state's legitimacy itself became a matter of political concern and question, and how Egypt ultimately overthrew the Mubarak regime through people's movements. And this is extremely significant. So the nature of state was changing, on the one hand, due to the extreme level of influence that the military was having in Egyptian economy, especially, but Egyptian politics also at significant moments from the 1952 revolution onwards. Now you have a situation, and this is true under Sadat, and this is true under Mubarak, and this is absolutely true under Sisi's government, even though just after the Arab uprising, Mohammad Mursi's government tried to limit the power of the military. That in itself caused the counter-revolution by Sisi and its military leadership. So the military asserted itself. And they control most of the Egyptian economy, the military controls. Like the situation in Pakistan, for example, to an extent in Turkey, and so on. The role of the military is a significant factor. So on the one hand, they provide some kind of stability to the state. On the other hand, they monopolize resources, and people suffer because of that monopoly of resources. So it is a kind of dualistic role by the military. The civil society movements, particularly the movement in 2011, wanted democracy to be established in a fuller sense. Even though Egypt had elections, etc., I myself witnessed one of Mubarak's elections. I was staying in Cairo University. I went to a election booth nearby, and observed elections the whole day out of my academic interest. And I talked to people, how they were voting and so on. When the results came, even in that booth, it was 99% in support of Mubarak. I knew the people I talked to, most of them voted against him. So elections were namesake elections, manipulated. And so the question of democracy was very, very significant. And younger people were much more vocal about that question. And 2011 uprising was an important thing because they were discussing across the Arab world through the Arabic language media, through the social media, and so on and so forth, their concerns. And in most other Arab countries, similar concerns were there. So there was a development of a kind of transnational public sphere that was happening in the 2000s because of all the transformation that we had and the new media becoming much more prominent. So some of these aspects of how various sections of the civil society participated in Egyptian politics in a variety of manners, that's discussed in the book. And for the readers, that would be something that is interesting for them to study. The overall direction of the book, the idea of the post-colony, Egypt as a post-colony, and this is particularly stressed in the last chapter, even though there are theoretical aspects discussed in the first chapter. Theories on state, traditional theories, the so-called third world state, that was a discussion at various points, Egypt as a third world state, and so on. The critique of various theories on state is also provided from various vantage points. The theory of postcolonialism works here in two ways. In the conceptual realm, postcolonialism is talking about the colonial discourses. How do they function? How hegemonic kind of narratives are produced, and how state in itself becomes one of the major agency of production and distribution of hegemonic ideas in society, and how different sections of the people are made into the other, marginalized in various ways, and so on and so forth. In the Egyptian case in particular, you have the historical understanding of a post-colonial society or a post-colonial state. Those states which underwent colonial rule in the past, and post-colonial state or society as a kind of historical understanding of politics and society. Most often, the theoretical understanding and this historical understanding need not match. They are two different things in most cases. But what is interesting in this book and what's significant here is to have that connections made. This historical transformation of Egyptian state from the early 90s onwards, how the whole post-colonial theoretical idea of colonial discourses or hegemonic discourses and the othering and marginality, how that becomes significant in this conflict between the state and the Egyptian civil society, and how people of different kinds, the women's movement, the youth movements, trade unions, etc., were addressing this whole question of marginality. So what you get out of the book is an understanding of Egyptian society as a dynamic entity rather than something that is living under a kind of dictatorship. Its political character, the military-dominated Sisi government, today it exists, but that's no reflection of people's political aspirations. They've always come out, and they have that history. So this dynamism of Egyptian politics is well analyzed in Dr. Priyanka Chandra's work, and I'm extremely happy that you have invited me to be part of this discussion on that book. Thank you very much. I once again congratulate Dr. Priyanka Chandra for her work.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Ramakrishnan, for sharing your thoughts with us. We are quite fortunate to have been able to hear you today, and hopefully can engage meaningfully with some of the ideas that you spoke about in this panel. I now request Dr. Fazil Rahman Siddiqui to please present these things.
Thank you very much. First, let me congratulate Dr. Priyanka Chandra for doing this book, which is quite significant. For many reasons that I will comment on. Then after that, I would like to thank the Center idea for having me as a discussant in today's program. I will start from where Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan has left. He was talking about some voting patterns and voting culture in Egyptian politics. In 2012, when the first time this election was held, the 70 years old lady was standing in queue and one journalist approaches her and said, "Are you here to vote?" She said, "Yes, in the last 50 years, for the first time I'm here to vote because I have no idea about the result." So that is the kind of political culture that it had been witnessing in the last 70, 80 years since this political culture has emerged. You know, there are two aspects to understand book done by Dr. Priyanka Chandra. What do we understand by Arab? When we speak, when we think, when we imagine of Arab society, there are a few questions which occurs to us immediately. Is it about its oil? Is it about its Islam? Is it about Israel? Is it about tribal society? It is about being the hub of the Cold War politics. It is about being the birth of three world religion. It is about authoritarian society. It is about complete absence of political culture. It is about Iranian revolution. It is about absence of democracy. It is about Western imperialism. It is about terrorism, radicalization. It is about oppression of women's and what's not. The larger picture that comes to us when we talk about Arab world. And this picture, whether we can blame it on the Orientalist idea, or we can claim it, or we can blame it on the internal doing in the Arab world, large Arab world, or we can say our illiteracy about the large Arab world. What happens basically, when we think of Arab world, most of us commit a kind of blunder that we confine Arab world with the Gulf society. We try to draw a picture of Arab world by just looking at the Gulf Cooperation Council. The most of the imagination that we collect by looking at the Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC countries. We don't know about Egypt, we don't know about Morocco, we don't know about Tunisia, we don't know about Algeria, we don't know about Sudan. The reason being that we have a large number of diaspora. That is the basic blunder we commit basically. And on that basis, we have been able to acquire opinion. Arab is important for many reasons, and every basis has its own distinction. There was a time when Arab was known for Islam. There was a time when Arab was known for oil. And the time came that it was known for Israeli politics. Zionism and all the plantation Israeli state and what were you meant call it. But now the situation is different, for example. We are living in a post-Israeli society. Israel is the reality. Oil is not that important. And even Islam basically is not that important for the Arab world as well, and for the rest of the world, because we have seen the differentiation of Islam. We have basically reduced it in different ways, basically modern Islam, moderate Islam, religious Islam, Muslim Islam, what way you can give it. Now we come to Egypt. Why Egypt is important? Why Dr. Priyanka Chandra has chosen the topic. Post-coloniality and statehood, the case of Egypt. Egypt is important for many reasons, for historical reasons, for its culture, for its politics, for its historical continuity, for its contribution towards civilization, for its role in Arab world, being a largest demography, military, economy, engagement with the world politics, world order, new world order, basically what we call this colonial world. For the first time, it was 1798 when Egypt encountered the purely Western in the form of Napoleon attack. That was the turning point for the Egyptian society, and when they started engaging with the new world, that was the beginning of what we call modern Egypt. Before that, it was a part of Ottoman Empire, then there is different Mamluk dynasty and all these things. Again, we think why Egypt is important because did it fight many wars with Israel? 48, 56, 67, 1973 war, and all this. The world respected Egypt once because it has one of the most prestigious religious seminary in the form of Jamia Azhar. We know Egypt because of Pan-Arabism. We know Egypt because of Nasser. We know Egypt because of socialism. We know Egypt because of the charisma of Nasser. We know Egypt once was the champion of Palestine, which carried Palestine with a slogan for almost 40 years. We know Egypt because it was, today still happens to be tried basically, project itself as a major power, and that is not. When you start studying Egypt, many questions will occur to you, and that each and every question will remain unresolved, completely unresolved. What Egypt used to be in 15 and 60s, today it is completely redundant, defunct, neglected, marginalized in the Arab. People might question, after 1967 war, each and every politics on Egypt had been imposed. They lost everything. They lost Pan-Arabism, they lost Arabism, they lost the role of charismatic politics, they lost the centrality they had enjoyed, they lost the appeal they had to the Arab world. And 1967 war was contested with a different kind of image that Nasser had acquired by himself. And that was, I think, lost made, I think. Decline of Egyptian Pan-Arabism had started after the breakup of the Arab Socialist Republic that they have joined in 1958. It was 1958, 61 they broke up. Then the Yemen war, 62, 70, then 67. So that is how we see how the decline of Egypt is constant in the last 50 years. And since then, Egypt has not been able to revive its position. Till 56, it was okay, I think. Nasser fought the war. It was not. I will come to that, what Dr. Priyanka Chandra has elaborated in a book. 56 war was not about this expression of nationalism. It was a kind of, trying to bargain with the United States when they refused funding to expand that. And why they did it? Because Egypt refused to join the security pact formed by the United States. But 1956 war made him quite popular. It was the first instance in the recent history when the military defeat is converted into a political victory. He became a hero, basically. He was fighting a new world order that was erected following the Second World War. Then 67, then 73, then 79, then 82, then 87, then 91, then 93, then 2000, 2001, 2006. These are basically blocks and phases of history or history. Everywhere Egypt is involved are the reluctant actors. Why Egypt go to war in 73? They went to war because they wanted to negotiate with Israel. I think that was the foundation of what we have been witnessing today. Whenever Egypt wanted to break a kind of a stalemate, they went for the war. The basic idea behind the war of 1973 was to bargain, to strike a negotiation with Egypt. And that legacy continued till October 7, 2020. 73, they went for the war. They came, then happened 70. Camp David. 87, they went for the uprising, Palestinians, they learned from Egypt. Then we see Oslo. 2000, they went for another Intifada. We see the Arab peace plan. Then 2006, they went again, Hamas went. Then from the formation of the what we call Russia, UN, US, and Quadriped, I think, formation of. So whenever there has been a stalemate, that was the best strategy adopted by this first by Egypt, and then Hamas, and what we will call it, just bring them on the table. That legacy is continuing today. And most of the time they have succeeded. But this time they did not succeed because the situation was completely different. After 2006, after 2014, the situation was quite different. The world politics has changed, the regional politics has changed, and internal domestic politics, Palestine has changed. So Hamas failed to understand this. What I was saying is after 67, Egypt's sway in the region is constantly declining. Why it was declining? Because of the kind of slogan and rhetoric that Nasser was involved. It was completely backed by his own charisma. Of course, he was a very charismatic leader. In the long history of Egypt, he was the first Egyptian to rule Egypt. That was very unique to him. And he knew it, that I'm very popular. He used to say, I have the button. If I have to make people go forward, I will press the button. And I have to people bring the backward, then I will have the button. And he knew the pulse of the people, what people want basically. And he carried on two things: anti-colonialism and this anti-Zionism. And in both fronts, he failed. Completely failed because a time came when Dover defeated ideology. By 17, I think he was the last entity. Died in 17. And by that time, you had petrodollar, you had New Islamism headed by King Faisal. So there was a complete Arab world was completely divided in two camps. One was Pan-Arabism and was Pan-Islamism. After the death of Pan-Arabism, what you call Pan-Islamism, it was the Islamist era, and then that was completely supported by Sadat. Sadat was known to be a believer president, a Mu'min president, a faithful president. Sadat wanted to do what undo Nasser. His entire focus was to undo Nasser. In a way, he was hating him, despite being a yes man for the last 15 years. And most of the things he did under pressure of Nasser. I will give you one example. When Sayyid Qutb was hanged, Nasser knew that he's the man of MBH. And it was Sadat who introduced Nasser to MBH. And Nasser and MBH, they had closely collaborated in 48 and even in 19, though there was some issue after this revolution. What MBH wanted, they wanted to be the part of the cabinet, and they wanted to have a ministry, two ministries they wanted, education and foreign. And Nasser refused. That became the basically turning point, and that became the rift between two. So Sadat did not like Nasser, but he had no option. The verdict to hang Qutb was written by Sadat. Just to tell him, and just to fix him, and just tell his position. He wanted to know. He knew that this is a man, anytime he could be dangerous. The first thing Sadat did after coming to power in 1970, he tried to undo everything what Nasser was doing. He became pro-Islamist. He freed most of the prisoners. And he was also leading to communist, unlike Nasser. Nasser started a crackdown against Islam, against communists also after this Iraqi revolution. Because after Iraqi revolution 58, Nasser wanted them also to join this Arab Socialist Republic, but they refused. Because of the ego problem between Nasser and this, Egyptian, this Iraqi leader. Syrian was pretty scared. This alliance could have gone on, but no, Nasser started intervening about that. He became assertive. Pan-Arabism basically it was not about Arab unity. It was a kind of Egyptian hegemony in the region. And that was realized very late by Nasser. Then he started talking about, Arab solidarity, Arab association, Arab friendship. And he left this entire idea of Pan-Arabism and Pan-Islamism. Basically, he abandoned it. And Nasser came because he came in a very different circumstances. Economy is in a very bad shape. People were with quite a pain with the defeat of 67. Army was quite exhausted. Russian was quite assertive, and they were not giving him what he wanted. And he wanted to modernize his army also, because again he wanted to take this line. What has taken this 67, 9, all these things. And he realized that, Russia are not being, Russia outside Soviet Union. They are not being friendly to us. So it's high time for us to shift to US. So that move, the shift was out of compulsion, not he was in love for the US. He had no other option. He wanted money, he wanted weapons, and he wanted to rid of Nazi's idea. And moreover, he wanted to create a kind of image of himself, because he has to show that I feel different from Nazi. But he wanted to take some credit to it. And to a large extent, I think he was able to take the credit by 1973. Though it was a half success, things were turning in favor, but later on with the intervention of America and all these things. 73 they realized, oh my God, I cannot survive with the help of Russia, with the Soviet Union. So we had no choice. We had to go to United States. And United States was looking for an opportunity to bring the biggest country in the region out of the Russian fold. They thought if Egypt comes out of the Russian Soviet fold, then the Israel will be single power in the region, and that they were quite successful. And gradually, giving money, giving this engagement treaty and all these things, gradually Americans started working. I think for 5 years they worked with the Kissinger under this Nixon, then under Carter, how to create a kind of, an alliance between Israel and Egypt. And they were successful. Like today, they are working for Saudi Arabia to make the part of the Africa. What happened after this, it did not help Sadat only. It helped Israel also. After signing a Camp David, Israel defense budget immediately cut down to 20%. Now they had not to bother about one of the biggest military in the region. So Sadat did many things, and I think Nasir was not from very humble family. Usually he was from bigger family. Sadat was from very humble family, and that kind of sense of deprivation was shaping his politics and shaping his image that I had to undo Nasir in many ways, in every way. But he failed to realize, the kind of Islamist approach and sympathy is showing to Islamists that could come back to him, and finally he became the victim. Why he became the victim, he knew it. The moment he's going to Jerusalem to sign religious to address the Knesset, I knew that things would be quite difficult for us, but he had no option. It was also a kind of imposition on that. Because money was there, and Egypt first was there, and they had also become tired of fighting a war of others. Sadat started telling Egypt first, like today we are heading from Donald Trump, America first. So they had fought 4 wars and it got them nothing. Once Nasir told also, why Faisal got scared, Nasir started talking about, share the oil money. So that also sent a kind, warning to these rulers, oh my God, this guy with a huge military, now he's talking about oil share. Sadat thought when Nasir couldn't do that, I want to do that. So it's high time to dump Palestine. And they dumped it. They knew it. The moment Egypt dumped it, no power in the region could come and could extend any kind of support to Palestine because they were there. And there was a time when some journalists called, Egypt jugular vein of Israel. So that is Nihal thing, I think that is a renowned editor. So in the span of 10 years from 70 to 81, since when he was killed, he did many things that to undo Nasir, to improve the economy, to appear to be pro-Islamist, to be anti-communist. But in between, I think, what happened with his Fatah policy like most of the countries, I think, they also failed. It created a kind of fat cat, what is very famously called fat cat, because those people were close to the regime. They got licensing and all these things. They got many contract. Even his own brother was a driver. In a span of 3 years, he was having five hotels in Egypt. Father own driver, father sister brother was driver. So you can see the kind of disparity that's happening. And that's in new level economy. You are the better one to tell. I think that is the biggest outcomes of the new level economy, the inequality that has grown very fast across the world. That was not confined to the Arab world. And then we have this. I will also just lighten the mood. I will tell you, Egypt, I think she had written about somewhere this political wickedness of Egypt. I think they're very smart. Graffiti and all the I have seen during this Arab, Arab rising. There was 74 to 79, there's a lot of diplomacy was going on between America and Egypt. Kissinger was the man who sometime in Tel Aviv, sometime in Cairo, sometime in Washington. So when Sadat became quite fed up, and he wrote to Kissinger, I cannot expect peace because you're a Jew. And they had developed a very good relationship. Kissinger used to address Sadat as the brother Sadat. Kissinger wrote him back, Mr. Brother Sadat, you must know, I am first Secretary of State, then I'm American, then I'm Jew. Sadat wrote him back, anyway, in Arabic, we read from right to left. In Arabic, we read from right to left. So that was the basic equation. And we still have, I think that culture also is still very much in existence. Then came Mubarak. There was a difference between Mubarak and Sadat. When Sadat took over, he took over a system which he had already decided to undo. Mubarak took over, he was bound to embrace this and to diversify it further, to expand it further. And unlike Sadat and Nasir, he was a very cool person. He didn't want any credit, any charisma and all this. He was simply inherited a system which was already very much in the place. But by the time he took over in 81, his policy, economic policy, and this is the era when completely you don't know much about what is happening at the political front. Politics was completely settled after the defeat of 67. After that, only we are hearing about economy. A structural adjustment program, IMF, World Bank. You don't know much about what's happening in politics because at that time the politics is completely sidelined. What was happening in the political front that was being impacted? Politics has become the secondary thing to the people of Egypt. 81 to 9 and 2000 was a kind of complete copy paste what Sadat had done. But 2000 onwards, I think it became a kind of crony capital. It was the era when traders and businessmen started joining politics. Till 2000, okay, whatever the outcome, whatever the negative and positive outcome one could have, a country could have out of realization, a lot of impositions on the IMF and the World Bank, subsidy removal, welfare scheme, bread right at 1977. But after 2000, I think the things were handed over to his son, Jamal Mubarak. That was the real problem when Egypt started boiling. Between 1995 to 2010, there is a figure of traders and businessmen who joined parliament from 37 to 77 to 100. In 1995 to 37, 2005 down, it was 77, and by 2010, it was 100. Just you can imagine what kind of nexus that was developing. And this was the time when it was the crony capitalism because, where the tourism was there, and therefore everything was handled by business class and all these things. So that is the overall picture of the Egypt that she has elaborated very excellently. And she has spoken about civil society, the role of women, Muslim Brotherhood, in Jamia as well, and how these things, how women are at the forefront, and how the post-colonial society, coloniality and statehood But I will come to that later on. I'll make some observation also. Otherwise, as a discussant, I would not be able to do justice. I will come to that later on. Everything blaming on post-coloniality, I think it won't be a fair idea. Egypt had its own identity as well. And they're very proud of it. You know, there are certain schools which think about, national identity had emerged only in a position of colonialism in the third case. But before that, I think Egypt, it was a really proud nation. For their Nile, for their Jamia, they were so proud of Jamia. In 1930, the Mufti of Al-Aqsa Mosque, he was planning a mosque to build the Jerusalem University. That finally came out. You know, whole Egyptian state and the royalty and the king and the Mufti of Azhar, they were against it. Nothing should come up which could match Jamia. So see, this is a kind sort of pride they used to have. They have a pride in the language, they have pride in their, in their language, in their literature, in their literary figure. And they have a literary figure, they have Nobel laureate, Najib Mahfouz, then they have Tao Hussein, then they have Akkad, then they have Rafat Sabi, these people travel to. And I think. And of course, it might have expedited the process of, national identity. But I think before that, they knew about themselves. Your book talks about it a very, very structured book. And you talked about the state definition. You have tried to look at the state with different perspective, from Hobbes to Locke to Maximilian to Karl Marx, the structure, his glasses. And I think you're talking about how Nazism came, and you have your title, from 71 to 2011. That related very well how the society has changed, how the IMF has impacted society, how the World Bank and economic policy has impacted the society. Where are these people? Where are the Muslim Brotherhood? Where are Jamia? Where are women? And concerning these things have done very well. But I have to make certain observations. And I have, because I had spent the money, so I went to book. And so I have to make, I think MBH, was a part of the politics. And they had very good rapport with Nasser. They were not tolerated. You had mentioned somewhere, I think they were not tolerated because they knew that pulverization politics. And there are some allegations that, MBH was the Western creation and all these things. They had recently, I think, Egyptian media has started telling that, they have some link with the fascist in Germany and all these things. It was not MBH. It was a young Egypt, the organization that was running parallel to MBH. And I think led by Mr. Amir Hussain. So they were really, of course, in touch with Germany. You had also mentioned somewhere the Arab state are obsessed with power. I think every state is obsessed with power. If a state is not obsessed with power, I think it's not a state. The whole philosophy of power is emanates from the state. It's both are synonymous, I think. The state has authority, and power is authority to allocation of values. Sadat came to power in 1970, not 1971, if I'm not wrong. Please correct me.
Yes, 1970.
But I think
No.
that's a 70. This entire debate about, political Islam and Wahhabism. I think these are two different things. Political Islam was mushrooming under Wahhabism and all this inside the Latin system. Wahhabism is a very quietist philosophy. They don't talk about a state. They talk about society. They do not talk about political participation. But political Islam is something which begins with the concept of state. They are of the view that unless you take the state, you cannot reform the society. Wahhabism is quite conservative in their approach, but political Islam is not. There are evidences of that. It was the only, I think, accommodative politics of Nahda in Egypt, in Tunisia, when they stopped calling themselves Islamists, they started calling themselves Muslim Democrat, like Christian Democrat in Germany, not just in Germany. So they are quite accommodative. But they're very manipulative also. When Morsi came to power and he sought some loan from IMF, and this, these are basically, it's all about interest. They take some interest. When some person asked him, "Sir, you interest is not allowed in Islam. So how do you justify this? I'm loan interest." What Moses said, no, we are not paying interest. We are paying the administrative charge. So this is how you can be manipulative, you can be accommodative, what you can call it. So Wahhabism is a very stagnant thing. This political Islam is really, they are ready to accommodate. They have changed a lot. They have compromised and they are ready to compromise. They have been making compromise. And those who have not, I think they have failed. Egypt is this example. Tunisia, they succeeded. But later on, they tried their level to accommodate and to compromise. And I still remember his statement by Tunisian scholar when someone asked him, "So what is the difference between Egyptian Islamists and Tunisian Islamists?" He said, Egyptian Islamists went for victory and we went for success. So there's a difference between victory and success. One can see. You also talk about this Islamic regulation economy, regulatory economy. Islam fully believes in right to property, complete. You don't have any check on that. You can right to property. There is no regulation, economic regulation. And that's why when Nasir was trying to impose socialism, there were a lot of opposition from the LNG class, from Jamia. They no concept of socialism. So when Nasir saw a lot of opposition coming, then he started talking about social justice. This entire slogan of socialism is gone. Then again he started talking Islamic socialism. Even then, no, you cannot. You cannot affix and solve this thing. There is no concept of socialism because socialism, regulates and it stops you from being ambitious. But Islamic right to free property, private property is checked by the concept of zakat and the kind of social responsibility. So there's a difference between having a regulation and being socialist. So a lot of cry, will cry. Jamia even they call the conference how to address this one. Because by the time Nasir, by 61, I think he has taken over the control of Jamia, he was trying to manipulate that. So even they had their own limitations. You also talk about somewhere, there's a lot of divergence between state and people's interest. I think in most of the cases, this is the only exception with Egypt. I think every state and the masses and the people and cities that have a divergent interest, they're just meeting the interest and convergence. I think is a bit impossible. And particularly in third world society, where the state is mean to basically, to oppress and to oppose anything coming from, they are not bothered about it. Particularly Arab state, they are quite brutal, I think, in their way. And that's why, and there's no civil society, that's why I think their interest also diverged. You have mentioned somewhere, about Jamal Abuddin Afghani and Rafat al-Tawi and Dahoud about the Islamic model. I think they do not not have much to say about Islam. They have spoken about, Islamic solidarity. They have spoken about Islamic Ummah. They have spoken about, learning from the Western world. They have spoken about you have to learn from the, Western scientific and political theory. Rafat Hatawi, when he traveled to France, he was highly impressed. And he came back and he translated many of the French books that talk about politics. But these leaders, Rafat Hatawi and Abdahu had done, they didn't talk about Islamic model. And I can go to the extent of saying, none of the Islamist ideologues have ever spoken about Islamic model. That is the biggest failure of them. They talk about Islamic politics, they talk about Islamic ideology, they talk about Islamic governance, but they fail to give any blueprint, any model. And most of the Islamist writing is aimed at criticizing the Western model instead of giving their own model. From Maududi to Qutb, any you take up any Islamic scholar who talk about Islamic state, they fail to provide any model. They talk about Ummah, they talk about Islamic governance, they talk about Shura, they talk about council, but they fail to explain how your Islamic state would fit into today's concept of nation state that is the biggest reality on the planet. So none of the Islamic scholars they have ever. If you ask them, they will even a scholar like Maududi, despite opposing democracy to the null, even he had to take the help of democracy, and he said what he said, democratic caliphate. See the contradiction. While you are opposing democracy, then what is the point of bringing and dragging a concept that you have kept on opposing for years and years, and the basis of that opposition and negation that you have developed your own model, but you fail to do that. Chandra, somebody you have, I think, correct me if I'm wrong. Somebody you were talking about, Jews and millet. Millet is not sect, right? Sect, millet, and sect.
So they're different.
But I think you have quoted somewhere in some of the citation, I think. Millet is not. They're two different. Jews is not a millet, it's a complete sect. Right? Millet encompasses the people of particular religion, like millet system in Ottoman Empire. That the millet encompasses Islamic Muslim community. And this state legitimacy is basically derived from economic well-being of the state legitimacy. I think there are many factors which use a kind of use the state. For example, Libya. When Libya went for the revolution, still most of the people, not most of the people, those who know Libya, I think, today they lament and they ask the question to themselves, why they went for it? Because it was one of the most, vibrant, prosperous, wealthy society. Education was being, medical was being, people were getting each and every economic benefit. But still they went for it because it is very popular in legitimacy. Just economic would not be the criteria of legitimacy. For example, Qatar. Just to call it an legitimate state as a legitimate regime, we have no idea. Then patriarchal notion of authority undermines the efficacy of the political institution and social modernization. I think Iran, Saudi Arabia today, changing Saudi Arabia, the total challenge to patriarchy. Iran, the best example. 50%, more than 50%. Education is, women have not gone. They're more education in Iran than men. But still, it cannot be called, a very modernized, very pluralistic society despite being modern. So we can have, different kind of definition about modernity. people are talking about Islamist modernity. There are various discourse. Ultimately, I'm of the view, this entire discourse, state society relationship, citizenry, and civil society. In case of the large and Arab world, I think it is the state which contributes to determination. You can have a civil society for namesake. Today, after this 2012-11 revolution, the kind of vanity that is created in case of Egypt. If you are not with the regime, you are terrorist. What happened to those sections of society who spent millions and millions on the Tahrir Square? One should ask it. The kind of vanity that has been created, either with the state or in Islamist. So what is happening in between? What about the socialist section? What about the secularist section? What about the democratic system? What about the civil society? What about the human right? There could be various models. It's not about only military model, Islamist model. There could be various secular, neutral. What has happened there? It has proved, I think, that in the state is the part which controls everything. And they will keep on doing that. In Tunisia, just day of yesterday, I read somewhere, Tunisian president is talking about bringing back, technology. See how powerful they are. Once again, I would like to congratulate your speaker, Chandra. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much, sir, for your remarks and for bringing out the international and regional context needed to understand S-Trade region. I would like now to go to Professor Jyotish and ask him to please learn this.
Thank you. So I will also start by congratulating Priyanka on publishing this book. So let me start by saying that I'm not a West Asia scholar, but so when Priyanka asked me if I can comment on this book, the excuse I could think of was, what does the book talk about, which is at least tangentially related to political economy? And then I think once I had a conversation with her, it became very clear that this is not just a book on Egypt, that there are wider implications for the scholarship that is presented. And I think I'll restrict my remarks to that because I think the regional implications have been very, very covered. So I think I broadly deal with scholarship around political economy of development. And when you go through that scholarship, it's pretty clear that in the last few years, there's been a lot of interest in heterodox scholarship around democratization and development. And in at least, especially in the last decade or so, there's been an attempt at moving beyond culturalist explorations of authoritarian resistance and an attempt at looking at things from political economy, class formation, and post-colonial state structures. And I think your book really fits in adding to that scholarship. So most recently, there have been works specifically on Egypt by scholars like Sarah Salem, Adam Hanley, Albert Kente, I think Cambridge sociologist Abdul Rahman. All of them have asked these questions like, what kind of class formation emerged from decolonization? What happened to Nasserism? How did neoliberal restructuring alter these key configurations? And why did the 2011 uprising occur when it exactly did? Okay. So the book actually makes a very distinctive intervention within this conversation by centering the post-colonial state. So the book does it by not simply calling it an authoritarian apparatus, but as a historically sedimented institutional formation shaped by colonial inheritance, military dominance, as well as neoliberal restructuring. And I think I would like to focus on those three. So I think it's useful to read the book inductively in that we can understand a lot about the neoliberal political economy in post-colonial context by studying. So first, I would say try reading it alongside Sarah Salem's work on Nasserism as hegemony. An important contrast emerges that Salem had argued that Nasserism represents the only genuine moment of hegemony in modern Egypt, and that at that time there was a balance of coercion and consent, and it was grounded in land reform, public employment, third worldism, and developmental nationalism. So your book uh, begins a sustained analysis in 1970. So it was actually very interesting to read it alongside. So because at that precise moment is when the hegemony kind of starts to unravel. So in the book, you start to see that neoliberalization in Egypt doesn't simply represent economic reform. It is actually a transformation of elite power. So under Sadat and Mubarak, the military doesn't just withdraw. That doesn't happen. And it does not professionalize away from politics. And in fact, it deeply embeds itself within the economy. So neoliberal reform does not really produce a competitive capitalist class independent of the state, which is what usually neoliberal economics argues. And instead, it produces a military bureaucratic elite, a politically connected business stratum, an externally anchored accumulation regime. And this really resonates with some of the political economy literature that has been coming out from scholars who study the Gulf region as well, where they argue that class formation in Egypt cannot really be understood on the national scale alone. It must be situated within the regional as well as the Gulf capitalist circuits. So, in this sense, neoliberalization in Egypt produces not just liberalization, but a kind of transnational class creation, right? So, military is not a national political actor. It becomes part of a geopolitical accumulation structure tied to US aid as well as Gulf capital. And that's very analytically off. And it means that neoliberalism is not just about market economy, which is what a lot of us have studied in political economy. It is about elite reconstitution within global capitals, which brings me to the second point. And I believe one of the strongest arguments in the book, if you read it alongside political economy literature, is the emphasis on rent. So in economics, we refer to corruption as rent, but there's a reason why we call it rent and not corruption, because you can't neatly make a distinction between what is corrupt and what is not corrupt. So Egypt's economy, especially post 1973, becomes deeply rent dependent. In that, it's dependent on US military aid, revenue from Suez Canal, remittances, Gulf capital inflows, and also a lot of debt relief policies after 1990. So there are scholars like Kenley who characterize Egypt as a fragile, meaning that their progress really rests on strategic rents rather than any kind of rents which transforms the productive potential of the economy. And it's important to make that distinction because I think one of the classics of political economy of development literature is that based in Southeast Asia and East Asia, where a lot of their experience comes from state-led development, where they didn't bother about democratization for several decades, and instead they focused on cultivating state capacity. And if you sort of come up with a liberal institutionalist lens of looking at that as corruption, then pretty much everyone outside the West is corrupt. So that makes no sense to me. So if you look at it from this description as rent and maybe state business relations, it's actually quite interesting. So from a comparative political economy lens, in East Asia, authoritarian regimes used rents strategically to build export-oriented industrial capacity. And look at China, the success that they've achieved is precisely that. Even today, the development that they or the growth rate that they can generate basically comes from their ability to control the basically the capitalist economy. So rents in that sense were conditional and embedded in technological upgrade. In Egypt, rents clearly functioned very differently because they were about cushioning macroeconomic crises. They were trying to stabilize ruling coalitions. They were substituting for productivity gains, and it actually reduced the urgency of industrial upgrade. So that distinction that we often make in mainstream economics, especially of corruption versus non-corruption, really makes no sense. So rents, if it generates cumulative productive capacity, there are a lot of examples from the global south of that helping progress. Egypt is one of those cases. So Egypt, what happens is rents actually consolidate the military bureaucratic class without producing any kind of industrial deepening. And this actually ties really well with Aaron Hanning's research, who observed Gulf capital in a very similar way. So he had talked about Gulf capital in key sectors like real estate, finance, and agribusiness that essentially reinforce speculative and outward-oriented accumulation rather than any kind of endogenous industrial integration. And if you take a look at the larger Gulf region, now they are very clearly emerging as an entertainment. So very clearly a lot of their economy is focused on speculation and entertainment. So they practically bought a lot of the sports in the world. So football, golf, tennis. They are becoming basically an entertainment hub throughout the world, and a lot of their growth today is tied to speculative profits. So neoliberal growth or neoliberalism in Egypt is not simply IMF reform. It is a kind of geostrategic rent. It is about the embedding of Gulf capital. It's about the consolidation of the military class and also the erosion of the social contract, which you dealt with quite deep. And I think that kind of configuration is very rich in it. Which brings me to the third point. That is, some of the political sociological literature on coercion. Also, I think it's very useful to read alongside this book. Especially Maha Abdul Rahman talks about something she refers to as the securocratic state, where the police and internal security expand precisely as neoliberal restructuring is deepening inequality. So in the book, you make the distinction between the state and the regime occupying this. So if the regime can become predatory, that doesn't really affect the people's perception of the state, which I think is very interesting. And I think it's very complementary to how a lot of citizenry look at Indian state as well. Where there is this belief in the state, even if you lose belief in the regime. Right? That distinction is actually quite interesting. So neoliberal restructuring under Sadat is producing labor precarity, withdrawal of subsidies, urban dispossession, and even a kind of feminization of poverty. But the social fragmentation is necessitating a kind of coercive stabilization. And that's what the state is doing during this era. So rather than neoliberalism shrinking the state, which we do talk about quite a lot in neoliberal political economy, it is actually reorganizing in that there is less welfare, more surveillance, more policing, and a greater insulation for the elites in the country. And it also kind of helps us explain why the 2011 uprising didn't really dismantle the state. Because the regime was changed, right? It wasn't the state that was being changed. So that coercive institutional core really is remaining intact. And the final point I want to make is directly related to development. So now I know your book is not like a developmental state, that's not your focus. But I actually found it interesting to read it alongside the developmental state literature by the likes of Robert Wade or Alice Amsden, who studied Southeast Asia. And the book, I think, implicitly raises a developmental question, which is that did Egypt ever really consolidate a national bourgeoisie capable of sustaining industrial transformation? So, I mean, a couple of years ago, I happened to be part of this reading group where one of the tasks that I was given was to read a planning document from Egypt in the 1950s. So a lot of what I know about Egypt comes from it. And so I think that planning document was authored by Ismail Sabri Abdallah, who was an Egyptian communist and very interestingly a member of the planning board in Egypt under Sadat as well as us. So he's an interesting character. And I think a lot of the developmental thought that he wrote about was quite fascinating to me because he's explicitly writing at the time and saying that we cannot just emulate the West. We have to find our own ways of understanding what our political economic configuration is and how do we become independent. If you take a look at Latin America, they focus on export-oriented development, and that means that inequality has increased. How do we avoid that fate? Is something he was very focused on. So he was arguing for a kind of internal integration, industrialization, which would be sovereign. So developing your own manufacturing capability and subordination of development to national liberation. Kind of third word is technological autonomy and walking on two legs, which is basically heavy industry plus labor intensive sector, right? So Egypt under Nasser was trying to attempt something like this. But after 1970, as all the panelists observed, the trajectory kind of shifted elsewhere. So you're moving towards external alignment, financialization, a kind of dependent development, real estate speculation. So neoliberal reform doesn't correct the structural weakness of the Egyptian development, which means that even the other day, I kind of want to bring this up. Periodically on Twitter, there's this debate that emerges about how India would have progressed if we had privatized TSM. So that really the configuration of political economy is what matters. So even if you had undertaken liberalization, which actually Egypt did several years, decades before India did, but look at the direction they went. And the direction that they went in is not because of the military when it comes to development. It is because of the configuration of the state there. Unless you build state capacity and unless you have some kind of state-directed accumulation regime that is possible, or at least if you look at the cases of states that have developed, which are outside the West, all of them have had some degree of state-directed development where they've controlled their capitalist economy. And then, at least for a while, they had a redistributive regime, after which, let's just say, they let the unfettered forces of the market, right? So, if you do it ahead of time, which is the argument you're making, you're essentially entrenching crony capitalism. And that's exactly what happens to Egypt. And it again really connects to a lot of the literature that already exists. So, in that sense, the implicit arguments that you make are really tallying well with what I've read in political economy. So, your offering of that political explanation for why Egypt is the way it is actually tallies very well with what we talk about in development literature as a middle income trap. Egypt is in a middle income trap. India is in a middle income trap. So, and this persists because we are under an elite coalition structure within neoliberal globalization. And that means that the state has very little autonomy to break out of this trap because we have an international economic order which has a paradigm of economic policies that are really not favorable towards breaking that. Right? And in that sense, the book certainly is not just a book on Egypt. And I would recommend people who are not just Egypt or West Asia scholars to read this. I think in the interest of time, I'll stop it here and I'll congratulate you again on publishing.
One minute without just one and a half minute. You talked about regime and state. regimes, a very classical case during Arab uprising. We have 4 cases. It all depended on army. In Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, and Libya. Egypt, what army did, they sacrificed the regime to preserve the state. In Syria, army sacrificed the state to preserve the regime. In Tunisia, army was quite neutral, both survived. State also survived, very smooth transfer of democracy. And army also survived in the state. In Libya, there was no army, state collapsed, regime collapsed. So regime and state is, sometimes we very often use interchangeably, I think, but this is to the best of my understanding, this is not the case. I think army, which is important case. Thank you. Sorry for that.
Thank you, Professor. I promise to keep it really short. Thank you so much. And you need to be so long. Firstly, Professor, congratulations on the book. But I'm speaking and asking my question with the naive hope of adding to this very fruitful discussion. And I wish to pose a few questions in the light of the understanding that I've had post reading your book. And I hope they take in that. For me, since first year of studying theory, and I'm sure this probably my peers will relate to, post-coloniality was always referred to as post-colonial condition, like it is some grim medical diagnosis given by a doctor that you're suffering from this condition of post-coloniality that you can never get out of. But just after reading your book, I will say that it was a relief for me to see that your position of the concept of post-coloniality moved away from this medical condition of suffering, but rather possess post-coloniality to be a gradual process of recovery and redistribution, rediscovery, navigated through the organic variables of the post-colony. And in your book, Professor, civil society assumes central significance in locating this democracy in the post-colony. For the benefit of the audience and for the question, I'd like to just, in short, flesh out certain arguments that Professor made in the book, in short. The civil society has been central significance in the book in terms of finding democracy in the post-colony. Because the legitimacy of the state depends on the position of the citizen vis-a-vis the state and the time and the space that the state allows the civil society. So here, moreover, civil society movements are important to catalyze a democratic journey within the society, which helps to renegotiate the social contract. That is because civil society movements challenge or sort of take a critical view that of the power that the state holds, which is very important for democratic journey to arise in the post-colony. Most importantly, what this does is when the state becomes increasingly subservient to the process of neoliberal globalism, like Professor Rohit rightly started out, and it starts sidelining the domestic political and economic consideration of the people. It is the civil society that posits the local against the global through social movements to contest this subservient posture of the state. So essentially, to put it plainly, it is the protests and the civil movements that you and I as people, when we posit this in front of the state, we are fundamentally asking a question about what is the nature of the state that the state is assuming and submitting to neoliberal globalism, right? The question that has arisen in popular discourse in the face of increasing protests, in the face of the rise of non-state actors and civil society movement is whether the state is even relevant today, and whether the state remains central in the discourse of international politics. And Professor, you answer this question in the book by comparing us, and I remember I asked you this in class as well. I asked Professor in class, the smaller people or the individuals or the groups who protest the state, they're no longer scared of the state to protest it. And I remember Professor Saranji outlines this in the book as well, that we need to start looking at civil society movements as not ones that demand the overthrow or the upturn of the state, but one that is asking the state to step in, to expand its role and to play a more regulatory role in the face of neoliberal globalism. And I would like to quote Professor here when she says that, and this is specifically when it comes to the post-colony, she said, "We are citizens of a post-colonial era, seeking the protection of state politically as well as economically," end quote. So the assertion here is that the state is not passive. It is still central, but we are to look at civil movements as one that asks the state to step in and protect their rights in the face of oppressive neoliberalism. But Professor, the question that came to me when I read this was that this assertion that the state can expand and play a regulatory role raises questions and perhaps even invokes anxieties about the exact nature of this expansion of the state that we're talking about, and in its expanding regulatory role. And this assertion and this statement can create different anxieties for people having or retaining different positions in the civil society. By this I mean, and this brings me to my main point, is how you are placed in civil society and how you view as the state stepping in can invoke different anxieties within, which brings me to the position of women in society. And to understand the position of women in society and how they are placed vis-a-vis the state, it is important to look at the Arab uprising. The Arab uprising helped me to understand this different position of women vis-a-vis the state. The public sphere in Egypt during the uprisings surely evolved to incorporate all voices. Professor mentions in her book the quiet encroachment of the informal people. Um, so the civic society, of course, evolved to incorporate all voices. But this incorporation was not without its fair share of violent retaliation from the state unleashed upon the bodies of women. We see this in the sexual violence unleashed upon women, not just by society, but also armed officials and the state in itself during the uprising. So this sexual violence against women by society and the state was unfortunately not an event specific only to the uprising period. But what the uprising period did, and from what I understood, was it solidified sexual violence against women as an institutionalized tool of the state in order to curb protests, specifically that led by women. So, and you also say that it is even more problematic that sexual violence used by state has become an unstated state policy of oppression. So, what we're seeing is perhaps that the use of sexual violence doesn't stop at the regime itself. It didn't stop with the regime of Sadat, it didn't stop with the regime of Mubarak, and it hasn't even stopped with the regime of LCC that we see today. Female genital mutilation and sexual oppression of women by state forces is still very much prevalent with the regime of LCC, even if that is not the scope of the book. But we see that the use of sexual violence as oppression has not stopped with one particular regime. Which is where, in this regard, it seems that the regime and the state have become enmeshed into one political identity and fused together, especially for the position that women view themselves vis-a-vis the state, where it's becoming tough to discern where the state ends and where the regime begins. The modes of oppression used against women, as you said, are manifold. Be it the patriarchal state enabled by the misogynistic society, a rigid private and public distinction that feminist scholars have forever fought against, or most importantly, the state-driven sexual violence to suppress women from the state to show women their place in society, which obviously is not in the public or the state. The civil society of the public space then appears as a hostile environment for women to partake in, especially in the participation in street political movements, which becomes a precarious position for them to occupy due to the looming threat that if they participate in street protests, in civil movements, sexual violence is the immediate possibility that they face. So, in a sense, the public sphere perhaps becomes even more a cultural space for women to occupy, keeping them from assuming their complete and rightful places in the society. Now, due to the position of women with respect to the patriarchal state, women perhaps do not enjoy the privilege of looking at the state as a benevolent figure willing to step in and protect their rights. Women then seem to be in an even more disadvantaged position relative to the rest of the civil society. In comparison to men, in comparison to other aspects of civil society, they then must find themselves in a relatively more disadvantaged position when it comes to renegotiating the social contract. And this advantage is further amplified when you factor in the effects of neoliberalization, which are disproportionately borne more by women, as you outlined in the book. Because specifically, Professor talks about how the policies that were meant to assimilate women into the public sector and economic sector of the public life, with the onset of neoliberalism, they were conveniently rescinded by this same state, which promised them protection. So what I hope to paint here, which will lead me to my question shortly, is that women here are in a position of double jeopardy, right? On the one hand, the sexual violence perpetrated by the state against social movements led by them, and on the other hand, the vulnerabilities that neoliberal globalism leaves them open to. So then, the state, as you have rightly underlined, Professor, is the sole interface between the citizen and the global political process. But if we interpret social movements at large as asking for an expanding role of the state, which is the regulatory role of the state, could we then be prematurely assuming benevolence on the part of the state vis-a-vis women? Additionally, would the authoritarian nature of the state of Egypt ensure the protection of all civilian rights from the vulnerabilities of neoliberal globalism over regime survival and profit? Moreover, would the state ensure protection of all civilians irrespective of that individual's position vis-a-vis the state, especially when the regime and state for women appear to be enmeshed as one? Women have been one of the lesser favored social categories who continue to face violence at the hands of the state. Then, how then can women's social movement be read in the same light as the rest of the society? Additionally, on what assurance can women or could women ask the state to expand in the capacity that is being mentioned in the book? As historically they've seen that its expansion has left them with grave injustices against them, putting them in a further disadvantaged position. And then could this reads as an accentuated power asymmetry between the state and the women? So then could this accentuated power asymmetry between the state and women make the very act of renegotiating the social contract another manifestation of the state's diffused hegemony vis-a-vis women? I then would like to ask whether analyzing women's relations with the Egyptian state is feasible using this intrinsically Western device of social contract, especially when the state, which here we could read as local, and neoliberalism as the global, both appear to take advantage of the volatile position of women. Thank you.
That was one question.
Right, so in the endeavor of adding to this discussion by raising a couple of questions that formed in my mind as I was reading the book, I will attempt to delineate, trace that outline by delineating certain arguments within the book and external in the book. So the book problematizes, of course, the imposition of Western liberal notions of democracy and market economy onto Egypt, and the results that has been the case in many post-colonial states, disastrous and unwanted. In opposition to the structural democracy imposed top-down, the book talks about the Egyptian people developing discursive traditions and evolving a public consciousness to arrive at local conceptions of democracy, which are in a sense more organic, that they imbibe local familiar cultural influences. And a similar attempt can be seen with regard to reimagining concepts such as civil society, as well as social contract, or the state itself. Here, allow me to quote a point that particularly struck me in the book. While the criticism that the democratic model cannot be simply recreated in a non-Western valid, it does not justify a complete preclusion of the possibility of a political system that provides space for political participation and political representation. Now, my question preoccupies itself with this point and the contentions that arise when one engages in describing these local, cultural, and social resources and conceptions at work in this reimagination of the civil society, democratization, and social contract in Egypt, also relevant for other post-colonial states in the non-West. To approach some of these contentions, I find it useful here to invoke Saba Mahmood's work on the women's mosque movement in Egypt during the 1990s. Mahmoud argues that the liberal assumptions dominate what constitutes human agency and human nature and have become integral to our humanist intellectual traditions. Agency has largely come to be framed as an assertion of one's identity or of one's political and moral autonomy, and the capacity to realize one's interests by going against customs, traditions, and other obstacles. Now, yeah, this understanding of agency has been evident in both not just secularist feminist discourses, but also in strands of Islamist feminist discourse. Veiling has also been come to be understood within this subordination resistance binary, wherein the choice to veil has been perceived as women asserting identity, challenging orientalist perceptions, or as something that is still required to avoid sexual harassment threatened by the male gaze and so on. And the choice to not veil has been looked at as emancipatory and also as stemming from different interpretations of Islam by feminists, which affirm that in order to practice the norm of modesty, it is not necessary that it be embodied by women. While these constitute cited reasons for veiling, little attention has been given to Islamic virtues of female modesty and piety, despite many women wearing the veil, framing their decisions in this way. However, what Mahmoud persuades us to do is something completely different, which is to do away with the liberal connotation tied to agency, detach it from the goals of progressive politics, and understand how, in the context of the mosque movement, agency is entailed not just in those acts that resist norms, but also in the multiple ways in which one inhabits norms. The discourse is not about whether the norm of modesty is subverted or enacted by women, but rather different ways in which the norm is supposed to be lived and inhabited. Now, this reconceptualization obviously raises an array of questions. How does feminism look like devoid of the resistance discourse? How can we understand the importance of reconceptualizing agency in this context that Mahmoud writes about, while considering the argument that yes, as Riddhi has also given a large outline of, patriarchal structures do determine whether a woman can even choose to not veil, and as argued by some feminists, that opposition to unveiling sometimes results in newer forms of male domination being enacted in and through contemporary male discourse of the day. Now, the starting point here with her study about how the political subject of post-structuralist feminist theory remains a liberatory one, whose agency is conceptualized on the binary of subordination and resistance. However, this model fails to recognize dimensions of human action whose ethical and political status do not map onto this logic of repression and resistance. Now, this problematization of how the discourse of liberal progressive politics and the humanist assumption it makes, when examined by me with regard to the concept of civil society as well, raises contentions of a different kind again. As discussed in the book, the expanding civil society in Egypt witnessed, at times, convergences between secular and Islamist voices in criticizing state policies, NGOs, and sometimes human rights organizations as well. However, this in itself is not an indicator of democratization, as you point out, as some human rights activisms have been opposed based on an Islamist or an Arab view of a specific culture being attacked by the universalism of human rights agencies. So, a redefining of social and political norms that are linked to local Egyptian social, cultural, and economic structures and practices include thinking differently about democratization in itself. In recognizing this, Professor, you also warn of the threat of cultural specificity that remains and how we must examine it against the specific political culture of a society that is going beyond but not excluding questions of Islamic or Arab identity in a way that prevents co-optation by a particular regime, be it Islamic or secular. So, can the liberal rights discourse encapsulate the efforts at reimagining civil society in Egypt, or do we need to, as Mahmoud argues, contextualize some of the assumptions about the constitutive relationship between, say, action and embodiment, or resistance and agency, or self and authority that informs one's judgments about non-liberal movements such as the women's mosque movement? If yes, then how can alternate imaginations, not necessarily liberal in the kind of change that they're seeking for, be described without falling into the pitfalls of cultural and social relativism? The question further becomes interesting because there have also been academics like Sari Jalal Al-Azm who argue that to be critical of civil society for its lack of cultural relativity as a concept is, in essence, Orientalism in reverse. So seeking to employ epistemological specificity in this way would be orientalizing oneself again by affirming that there exist irreconcilable binarized differences between non-Western and Western societies. Here I rest my question, which largely arises out of the contention that such necessary reimaginations and reconceptualizations of agency, civil society, counter-hegemony would bring up, and the challenges it might pose to the state in its process of recognizing these different and sometimes seemingly challenging notions of what is agency or what is freedom.
Wow.
Priyanka, would you like to answer the two questions and then move on to question and answer, or should I take the questions first?
As you see. Can maybe do one round of answers and then.
Okay,
answer?
yeah.
This wants to get all the answers. Okay. I'm very concerned that you're going to make me give away all the punchlines of the book. No questions. But anyway, okay, first of all, I don't want to leave it till it ends, but I just want to say thank you so much to Ideas and to the Politics, Society and History Constellation within it, and to Professor Agha for organizing and hosting this. Very kindly, and thank you especially to the moderators for doing such a wonderful job. And thank you to the discussants, Professor Ramakrishnan unfortunately had to leave a bit early. And he was asking to hear the discussants and so especially to the students speak, and the students were keen to hear him speak. So that was at least part of it happened. That was wonderful. But thank you so much, Dr. Siddiqui.